start with, and perhaps this can sort of set the stage and the context for this discussion. You know, we often look back on like the past years, right, with the perfect hindsight. But you know, if you were to sort of put yourself back into where you were like a year ago or 2 years ago, and what you were expecting the future of blockchain to be, and like looking back on that now, what things have surprised you, or what things happened that you perhaps did not expect that, you know, is currently happening now in the space? Like what is the most interesting thing that happened in the last 2 years in your opinion?
Me, or should I just pass forward to this? Okay, everybody. Okay, so let me start. Yes, I actually cannot directly answer it. So everything surprised me. I would like to have it with a quotation or citation from the German Times magazine. There just was a little phrase saying, "With blockchain, it's like falling in love." You very often get disappointed, but it always keeps you attracted. Yes, and that's also the way I've just experienced blockchain technology. There are lots of ideas, there are lots of potential use cases, even perhaps idealistic use cases, but we are getting more and more mature. And what I'm really currently looking forward to is the way that blockchains are developing into a blockchain not are developing, but there are also tendencies to create blockchain operating systems. I have just in mind, not especially for that, but to have something set up like to be neutral, Linux, Windows, or Mac OS, and there's just a blockchain running behind it, such currently as a cloud system running behind the operating system. That's something which most fascinates me.
Well, IBM is a co-founder of the Hyperledger open source project to form blockchain frameworks, and we donated 2 years ago our own implementation, IBM blockchain, into the Hyperledger Fabric workstream with all the patents. And I was always talking for over 2 years now, about making blockchain real for business. And last year, Hyperledger Fabric graduated, which means the code is production ready. And I'm amazed by the speed of adoption in the enterprises, the announcements how enterprises are looking into blockchain as a basic technology for their business processes. And yes, questioning standards, interoperability, governance, and all the non-technical questions that come when they look with their fingers on the technology, which is amazing.
So the thing that, looking back 2 years, I think the thing that would have surprised me most, 2 years ago I was talking with people about which blockchain we thought was going to make it. So which one was going to replace Bitcoin, or was Bitcoin going to stay the gold standard of blockchains? And I think today it's become very apparent that there's not going to be a single blockchain. I think there's going to be, with all the technology that we've recently seen in interoperability and cross-blockchain protocols, I think it's become very clear that we will live in a world of blockchains, as in many, many blockchains.
Thank you. So one thing that stands out here, I think, in both of your answers is the sort of protocols coming to maturity, right? And so we're seeing, say for instance, IBM Hyperledger coming to maturity and becoming production ready. Obviously, Ethereum is also becoming a platform where a lot of people are building things, and that's becoming more mature, and the stack is starting to evolve. And I do agree that I think that the future is a future of multiple blockchains and multiple chains interacting with each other through interoperability solutions. But do you, and this is to each of you, and of course, given your respective backgrounds, I'd like to get your response. Do you think that at some point, perhaps in the next few years, there will be consolidation of protocols, right? I mean, at the moment, there are dozens of protocols. Can we expect to see most of those protocols either dying off or consolidating with others, and having a situation where there are perhaps 3 or 4 or 5 major protocols that are powering most of the innovation coming out of blockchain?
No, I don't think so. I think there are going to be, so obviously there are going to be templates. So if you want a run-of-the-mill blockchain for some application you want to be running, obviously you do not have to devise the entire protocol yourself. But I actually do see the plurality of blockchain protocols as something immensely powerful, and that this is actually a security feature. So actually having everything run on the same operating system. I mean, big companies know this. So big companies would never actually have one single operating system for all their computers, just because monocultures don't usually work there. Usually there are security weaknesses somewhere. And having some sort of diversity in the protocol layer is actually a good way to ensure against, catastrophic failures.
Well, I see it similar. The approach one size fits all usually doesn't work. Not with technologies, not with industry. So variety is massive. But of course, clients looking forward are looking into interoperability and standards. And this is what industry consortiums like Hyperledger turn into projects. If you look into the Hyperledger project list, you will see a Hyperledger Quote project, which is the former Interledger protocol of Ripple, which they abandoned, made it open source, and which is now being actively contributed now by Hyperledger to define interoperability or languages where ledgers can communicate. And I think this will be, this is a major requirement we hear from clients too.
Although the ladies were already asked, I nevertheless dare to answer. I think we hopefully will have somehow a certain consolidation. Compared to the TCP/IP network, which is currently roughly 35 years old, if you see from the first origins, we are in the early childhood of blockchains. And the same way as currently nobody discusses anymore about IP, TCP/IP, IPv6, or whatever, we will probably see a similar development, and hopefully see it, that the blockchain protocols are divided in a more separated way and layered somehow, so we can have exchangeable pieces and parts. And so, again, back to the idea of an operating system, which is not meant as a singular operating system, but perhaps a layer, a networking and communication layer, which can be used similar to TCP/IP, and you can just checkmark whether I want to have on-chain or off-chain data management, and whether I want to be a miner or just a light node or a full node or something, and that configures your basic communication layers. I think that could be a very good development over the next, let's say, 5 to 10 years, together with standardization, because they're very, very important.
Okay, we covered a lot here. So we covered standardization, interoperability, protocol standards. But I think perhaps interoperability is a good topic to follow up on. So in terms of interoperability, we've seen multiple solutions, whether it be new protocols and new blockchains that propose interoperability, or protocols on top like Metronome, or even some very new projects that propose the sort of DNS systems between blockchains. At some point, I would assume that standards will become necessary if these systems were to be implemented at a global scale. What are your thoughts on what the biggest challenges are in terms of interoperability in the coming years? And I mean, one interesting. It may be interesting to sort of make the comparison with interoperability and scalability challenges that the internet faced 20, 30 years ago.
Well, actually, I think the most problem in the interoperability and the evangelism of the hardcore developers, and that's something I really have to say, but what I'm really sorry about. You see many people in the community, even with a little or only little knowledge, and you see many people in the community who claim to have the full knowledge, and that's always hard to discuss with them. to have a discussion. Sorry to IBM, whether Hyperledger is blockchain or not. Well, perhaps it's not a blockchain, yeah, but what's the problem? It has mechanisms and protocols which are blockchain and distributed technology-like, and which are worth to be implemented in a major scale system. And I think at the moment it's really the challenge to get all these hardcore blockchainers somehow gathered, because the others are already prepared to merge functionality. Just one example before I hand over to Elke. I had just a discussion on the phone about a higher layered software structure and a domain-specific language. And one of these guys said, well, currently, unfortunately, the state of art is solidity. So first of all, why it is a state of art? And secondly, why unfortunately? Yeah, they have just created something people are using. What's the bad thing of having done something people are using? That's a good platform to improve things. And that's, at the moment, I see as the most problem.
Well, on interoperability, when enterprises start with a blockchain project, which is quite small in terms of participants at that time being, and small in the scope of the use case. But they have the larger picture that they say, in some years, I want to combine my supply chain use case with my financing use case. This doesn't necessarily mean that I have to merge that blockchains, because the overlap of the participant is not large enough, but they have to be able to exchange information, and this is what interoperability is at the first kind. And ESO is looking into interoperability in a study group, which means they are assessing what is around, what are the requirements of the users of a blockchain on interoperability. And one of the first statements of them was interoperability is not interchangeability. You cannot exchange modules and say this is interoperability. The first step is define interfaces that one application based on one blockchain can talk to another application which is based on another blockchain. And that's the first step. And let's look into this, how we can achieve that.
I think being not a standardization expert like the two of you, I have a somewhat more practical approach, or maybe a more naive approach, I guess. So what so far has worked for us pretty well is leading by example. So you basically you say what the interface is going to be, what the data structure is going to be. And you make this publicly available and say this is how we're going to use it. It would make sense if everyone who's going to do a similar thing is going to adopt the same protocol, because obviously once there's some adoption, that's the dominant strategy from a game theory perspective.
May I just add something to that? I would never contradict. I think it's important, especially in standardization, it's a very hard business, and it's also sometimes hardcore psychology one has to stand with, because there are different motivations for getting into standardization. But for me, it's even more important to see the process to standard, to see people talking together, to aligning opinions. The last part, it's quite good that you have a standard there, which is even not a regulative standard, it's just more a descriptive standard, but you have perhaps 100 pages of standard paper there, but the process that people have gone through is much more aligning and creating interoperability than everything else. And there you have people who say we want to lead by examples, and they create a wonderful supply chain management blockchain. Other people say, oh, how can we use it? We can never use this for license management. And these are more the guys on an abstract level and say, we need this, we need that, we need those. And here you have these deterministic process people with a Veeam software model, and you have the agile people, and you have all of those discussing together and getting a standard of it. And that's something, especially in terms of interoperability, which is most important for me. Less the information science part of interoperability, but more the psychological discussion between people and aligning opinions.
So I think that this is a point that perhaps we could address, and it's aligning opinions and I guess I would say the non-technical challenges to implementing blockchain, and we'll come back to some of the technical aspects a bit later in the discussion, but in your different areas of work, as academics, consultants, people, project managers and product people, what are some of the biggest challenges that you're seeing in a more of a change management perspective when dealing with the different audiences and clients that that you interface with? Perhaps starting with Friederike.
But one challenge we deal with, and I think we deal with, I mean, we kind of know how to deal with it now, is expectation management. So this is, I mean, this may sound mundane, but when people say the blockchain is a wild computer, this is technically correct, but it's a very retarded wild computer. So expectation management is everything, which is why currently what we focus on is integration with other blockchain projects, because they know the limitations that we're currently dealing with. Yeah.
And how do you manage those expectations? What advice would you give to people in this room, perhaps in that same situation, having to deal with that type of? It's an education.
I mean, what you do is you spell it out. You say this is how many transactions we can do a second. This is what a transaction costs. This means if you implement this and that, it's going to cost you this and that amount of money, and it's going to take that long. We expect this to be better in 6 months by so and so much, and we expect this to be better in a year by so and so much, and in 5 years we expect this to work seamlessly. And basically, so you adjust your numbers every now and then because technology changes and our expectation of what's going to happen changes. But you try to give people a sense of a time frame in which to expect a workable application.
And in addition to technology, what we observe with clients, well, for those of you who have never heard of Hyperledger Fabric, we're focusing on so-called permissioned or private blockchains, where enterprises collaborate together on a certain business use case. And bringing enterprises who often enough have a competition model, sometimes they are competitors, make them work together with their competitors in other business or use cases is not only a technology problem, it's also a legal problem that then legal people come in and say you have to formalize the collaboration. You have to determine where their headquarters are or which national right is applicable for that consortium, for that collaboration, which rules have to be applied from a regulation point of view. So a blockchain project is a lot about governance, regulation, and collaboration on a formalized level, at least in the enterprise space.
For me, it's most important. Well, I actually do not have real customers as I'm from university, but I have a lot of cooperation partners and also in the technical supervisory board of 2 companies. And there, once they approach me with the question which way to go, is usually the answer, although most parts of the blockchain community are thinking in an agile way, so just creating facts and creating software and making running prototypes, and architecture develops from development. I recommend them not to go this way because you have a problem. In the blockchain, environment, in today's blockchain environments, you have too many decisions which have to be taken in the very first moment, and they're unchangeable anymore. So if you have such a one-directional way which you cannot go back anymore, it's not really agile as you're working anymore, and therefore you have to take all your massive requirements, you have to do a good requirement document, you have to be sure that whether you want to be public or private, you want to have on-chain or off-chain management, and so on. And that's, I think, for me, the most elementary decision. Also, customers have to be aware. I usually tell them, prepare your requirements, and if you want to have blockchain, simply be open for blockchain. But there are a lot of use cases which are even better to be implemented not on a blockchain currently than just wanting to have a blockchain. And that's, I think, for me, most important. Yes, have the openness to it, but don't stick to it.
This again is expectation management. In some sense, I think is. I mean, this is something that I personally deal with quite a lot at Stratum as well, as speaking to enterprise clients that will come to you with a use case which was thought up in good faith and everything, but in the end really doesn't require this sort of data structure or this sort of trust model. It can be managed using very simple systems and not necessarily this sort of very complex blockchain interface. Perhaps it would be a good time to sort of transition into some of the technical challenges. So again, to each of you, I would ask a question, given your various backgrounds and the types of work that you do in the space, what would be, in your opinion, the biggest technical challenges that the blockchain industry will face in the next 3 to 5 years?
I see as a major challenge this interchain operability, because we are coming from Bitcoin, and that's what people in general associate with blockchain. Ethereum is most Bitcoin-like, considering a blockchain and smart contracts. Nevertheless, if we want to go further, we have to have in mind the off-chain data keeping, although even if you decide for Ethereum, because it's not possible to keep all, once you have data, to keep that in a big extent on the blockchain. And as soon as you want to outside interface to something, to sensors, we have a third connection to the blockchain, which is this Oracle singular point of attack at the moment, where you, for Ethereum, need to take something like Oracleize or something. So you have a single point of attack in a highly secured blockchain. So where's the sense of it? And this is a very big challenge, to have all these systems, again, cooperating, exchanging data, and did we call it interoperability?
Well, in addition to interoperability as a challenge, which I fully support, it's for, in the enterprise space, the connection to existing systems of record. If you have a use case which is not a greenfield approach, where it starts from scratch, you have existing systems, and you have to connect them, because some of the data you will use in your blockchain applications are in there, and you have to change the roles, that the blockchain is the leading asset management system, and your ERP system, for example, enterprise resource planning system, does the internal stuff, because the rules in the chain code on the blockchain are the ones, the business rules, which are valid for everybody in the network. But your cost distribution, business process management, where you store the things and things like that, this is individual to the enterprise and stays individual. So you have to align your enterprise IT to that, to have the asset management part in the blockchain and the business process management part in your existing records. And for some industries, the scalability is an issue. So we have been hearing this morning that Bitcoin, the pioneer, the very early form, had 7 transactions per second. No enterprise would use that, it's too low. With Hyperledger Fabric, the first numbers were about 1,000 transactions per second. This is still too low. IBM Research published a paper in end of January that they have reached 3,500 transactions per second. If you ask somebody from the banking space, from payment systems, they still say, okay? And when will you be enterprise grade? So scalability for some industries will take some more years, not only months.
I fully agree with interoperability and scalability. I think almost everyone in this space agrees that those are huge challenges. I'm going to cheat a little bit. I'm going to say governance. So governance structures, governance of blockchain. So basically, how do you update the protocol? How do you not have a blockchain chain come to a screeching halt because people cannot agree on how to go on? And I mean, obviously, you can say, well, you can always chance it, and West comes to the West. You provoke a hard fork. I mean, there are some people who say that this is a good solution. They are pretty hardcore, and I think most people don't agree. So actually finding a good way of governance for blockchain operations, just to see how blockchain protocols can be updated. I think that's going to be a huge challenge.
Not only how they get updated, but I mean, at a higher level, how people agree on how they get updated. I think that this is a problem that, again, it's not a technical problem. It's a sort of organizational change problem. How do people and organizations collaborate?
I mean, in a way, it is a technical problem. So basically, for blockchains that use proof of work, so basically the idea is that the people who mine, they decide on which way they're going to mine, and so if they can't agree, they just split up into two chains, and that's not a sustainable solution. So I mean, there is a solution. It's just not a particularly good one at the moment.
So perhaps, given Friederike and Elke's sort of different types of blockchains that you're working on, I mean, you're more on the consortium permission blockchain and on the public blockchain side. What types of initiatives have you seen individually that point that in each of your types of work there are governance solutions that will become available and scalable at some point?
Maybe I'd start with the public blockchains. So the governance question is a lot harder on the public blockchains because basically the premise is that anyone can participate. That's the hallmark of a public blockchain. So you can't really ask people to register somewhere and then it's not one person, one vote. The way that you would regularly do it. So basically, finding good governance structures is difficult off-chain. When you know who you're dealing with, it's super difficult on-chain when you don't know who is participating and who has an opinion and what their interests are. So there are a number of things that are a number of basic tools, I would say, for a toolkit of decentralized governance that people are currently working on. So one of them is TCRs, token curated registries. Another one is Futakis. Another one is good reputation systems that actually allow you to give people the power of making decisions based on their track record. So these are all actively under research, and so far there's not a single. So they're good ideas. There's not a single silver bullet. So I think it'll be a toolkit of measures that can be taken, and depending on the application. So I would subscribe to the philosophy that for this there's not a one-size-fits-all approach, and we do have really interesting ideas of how to tackle it. And I'm super excited to watch this space and how the DAO governance is going to go on, because I think it's fascinating and it's something completely different from what we've had before.
And just to support, even in the permission blockchains, governance is key. So IBM has an Institute of Business Value, and they published a paper after experience of forming 20 so-called active blockchain networks. The document is publicly available. The title is First on the Block, and they're finding as governance is key to define, for example, who owns the data or which part of the data. If you have transaction data, contract data, who owns the code or which parts of the code. It's all good when as long as they're a part of the consortium working with that platform, but if one of the participants decides to leave, you cannot delete on a blockchain. What are you doing when one wants to leave? The data is in there. So we have to define that, and this is one of the key requirements of forming enterprise blockchain platform, to look into that. Look into regulatory aspects if you are in a regulated industry, and simplify the process. So when you go into blockchain application, these are the 3 key takeaways from First on the Block study.
Nothing to add? Nothing to add? So you mentioned the regulatory aspects, and that is one topic that I'd like to touch on. There's just so many topics. Like this 1 hour discussion is not long enough. We can go on for hours. So on the regulatory side and on the legal side, and I think perhaps we could focus our discussion around Europe and North America, specifically the US. What are some of the biggest challenges that all 3 of you see on that front?
Well, actually, on the legal side, it is first of all very complicated to find a really harmonized legal view. So there are actually 3 different kinds of schools among lawyers. First of all, there's one theoretic school saying our laws, our modern law books are that flexible that they can cover all issues of blockchains, or let's say digital technology. Theoretically. There are others who say, well, principally it could turn sometimes into a problem, but we can find examples how to solve it. And there's a 3rd school, which I really take serious, saying blockchain technology creates problems in ways of finding decisions, in ways of fulfilling laws, by being stoppable, by being haltable, and so on, to make an objection against and stop just the performance or an execution of contract. This is a problem. This theoretically creates claims against claims for claims, but you don't get a solution. You only get theoretical solutions. And if you talk in terms of legal safety, in terms of predictability of a court's jurisdiction, then blockchain is a kind of unstable, because you actually cannot see what example a judge would take to classify the blockchain technology. So that's just one part which makes blockchain technology in its outcome, its legal interpretation, really vague and really insecure.
So I would actually see this from, I agree. So I think there are 2 ways to look at this. One is, what are the legal challenges for people operating in this space and for companies operating in this space? So basically, we need some sort of clarity as to what's okay and which rules we should heed, and what we can do to be compliant with laws and regulations. So that's a fairly practical problem. But blockchain actually gives rise to a series of really hard legal questions that, as far as I can see, our law has no way of answering the way that it is now. So basically, until now, there's always been some sort of way of shutting things down. So if there was an illegal operation, there was always someone who was operating it. And so basically, by going after the person who was operating the illegal operation, that was the way that law enforcement dealt with it. Now that's impossible. So now you can actually deploy something through the blockchain, and people always say it's just code, but it's deployed to a blockchain, and it can't be stopped. So it's going to happen one way or another, and there's no way of censoring it. It's less like writing software and more like building a machine that you build and release to the wild, and you have no power over afterwards. So this is a whole new set of problems that lawyers will actually have to deal with. So, yeah.
Well, just to add, if enterprises go into a blockchain platform which is international, this means at the end of the day, probably every participant complies or has to comply to another system of law. As long as they are quite close, like within EU, the Roman law type law, it's more convenient if you're going into, for example, UK or US with the case law, which is completely different from our system of law. They're doing the same what people are doing with the free trade contracts. They don't pick one law and say we comply all to that law, and if we go to court, we go that into this country. They define in the space of governance a kind of moderation. I don't know the English words for Schiedsgericht. This is what they're doing with TTIP and CETA. It's the same on paper. If you are not able to define one country and one law which is applicable to all the network, you define a moderation, a conflict management, and try to solve that on that level.
There are also two further things I have to add from the point of an ISO convener, which I just experienced. I'm not a lawyer, but I got a good legal education over the last 1.5 years for all the lawyers being part of these ISO groups. There are just two major challenges, and I would already tend to call them problems. We as computer scientists do and create with smart contracts. One problem is that we misinterpret the execution and the enforcement. A contract is a right for fulfillment, also called claims. The right of enforcement is not a part of a contract. So, for example, if you open a lock to a door for somebody who is paid a rent, that's fulfillment of contract. If you don't let the guy into the room where he has just entered and where his stuff is still inside because he didn't pay anymore, that's enforcement. Because you hinder him from something doing which he principally is allowed, which is get access to his stuff. And that's just one little tiny legal example where we software developers do things we shouldn't do. And you could also lift this on a higher level, saying, as long as you do not get a software developer a clear guideline, a legal guideline how something is to be implemented, you do legal interpretation. And at least in Germany, legal interpretation is at least not allowed, legally allowed, to software developers. That's for special job groups, professional groups, which is lawyers. And that's something where we are really heading into problems as software developers, because we can even now be legally enforceable by courts because we did something we were never educated for, and we are also not allowed to, which is to interpret laws.
I agree that there seems to be, at least in the blockchain space, an ecosystem of developers that, at least for some, think that it's up to them to interpret the law, or that they have some sort of interpretation of the law, when in fact it's up to lawyers, right, to interpret the law. How can we bridge that gap, right, between the software developer and on the other side, a lawyer or a legal advisor?
Sorry for directly answering, so I'm not too polite to our ladies here. But yeah, that's actually something we are dealing in ISO 307 in the working group 3. I just said we have a deliverable on smart contracts in general, which covers everything somehow, and we make a technical specification. We try to get one for software architectures for legal frameworks. Means as soon as we have created a state of art, which is internationally accepted, from this point or at this point, using this state of the art, a software developer is not interpreting law, but is just doing something he has learned from studies, from the state of the art, and so on. And in this kind, he is not personally liable again if something goes wrong, because he has just taken something internationally accepted. And that's really something where I'm pushing the full consortium of for working group 3, that we create something. That's something that software developers need even more than lawyers.
And in addition to that, there are around some developments of so-called domain-specific language. So make code or not teaching lawyers to code, but define languages, programming languages, which are more natural languages, so that a lawyer can define smart contracts, for example, within a blockchain without learning Go or Java or something like that. So educate the software developers and educate the lawyers and meet somewhere in the middle to make it happen.
Yeah, so I agree with both Elke and Volker. So basically certified smart contracts for certain things. So basically the German government is already talking about something similar for algorithms, and we should have the same thing for smart contracts. And one thing that we've started doing and we are trying to establish as a best practice is a way to is a way of deploying smart contracts onto the blockchain that still allows you to update this smart contract via delegate call. So it's I mean it's a new concept, and we've started using this, and we would fully expect that other people start using this soon as well.
Thank you. So one last question before we wrap up. So in your view, we've talked about the challenges all throughout this panel, and I think that you did a very good job at fielding all the challenges from the different perspectives. What, on the other hand, what do you think will be the biggest enablers for these technologies in the coming years? What are sort of the one thing that allow blockchain technologies to evolve into something that can be massively used in startups and enterprise applications and in the legal space and government space, etc.?
Reliable blockchain identities. So something, reliable blockchain identities, that's the one killer application that really enables almost everything else.
I think good blockchain platform or application examples so that enterprises learn from each other what works, what does not work. As soon as something works and brings really efficiency to the enterprise or to the users, then it's adopted. So think of the smartphones, of the swiping technology, not longer pressing button. Everybody agrees that this is a more convenient way to do things. And if you do some of these breakthroughs in the blockchain space, it will draw others into the technology and make them look with the fingers into that and follow this example.
I agree to both, and for the third part on top of it, which is the societal change to more liberty, borderlessness, means that there are countries meanwhile doubting their electoral systems. There are international corporations which are put on higher burdens because we don't trust anymore, but we have to cooperate. And this is, for me, the only way for good multi-regional corporations, I would say this way, where we want to exchange information, exchange goods, don't trust in each other so much anymore, and to recreate trust on an IT level.
Thank you. And so thank you to our panelists. I think they deserve a good round of applause. And thank you for sitting into this panel.